Hey there. I'm excited to announce this to you today. This is what you've been waiting for in your spiritual quest. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time, and I'm finally ready to announce it that it's ready to go. It's the Grief to Growth Community Circle. Now, this is a sanctuary where like-minded souls are united in their journey through grief and towards personal transformation. It's more than just a place. It's a beginning. It's a commitment to growth and understanding. Here you're finding not just a community, but you're entering a circle of trust and depth. You're going to engage with interactive coursework. You'll dive into exclusive podcast episodes and partake in discussions that illuminate the path from mourning to empowerment. This is a realm where every question is honored and every individual's journey is validated. To be part of this exclusive circle, visit us at grieftogrowth.com/community or look for the chat icon at the bottom of every page on the main website. Remember that entry is a privilege because I want to ensure that every member is as dedicated and genuine as you are. You must apply to join, but the journey within is worth every step. So go ahead and join us today. Check it out, grieftogrowth.com/community, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Hi there. Welcome to Grief to Growth podcast. Your host is Brian Smith, spiritual seeker, best-selling author, grief survivor, and life coach. Brian believes that the worst tragedies of life provide the greatest opportunity for growth. Brian says he was planted, not buried, and he is here to help you grow where you've been planted by the difficulties in life. In each episode, Brian and his guests will share what has helped them to survive and thrive. It is his sincere hope this episode helps you today.
Hey, everybody, this is Brian Smith. I'm back with another episode of Grief to Growth. And today I've got with me Martha Hunt Handler. And Martha is an author and a fascinating all-around person. But we're going to talk today about her book, what's called Winter of the Wolf, which just released a couple of days ago. So I'm going to read a short introduction, and then I'll bring Martha on. Martha Hunt Handler is an environmentalist, an award-winning author, and the board president of the Wolf Conservation Center. She's the author of the new book, Winter of the Wolf, which was available just a few days ago. It just came out on Tuesday. We're recording this on Friday, July 10th, 2020. Martha grew up in northern Illinois dreaming about wolves and has always understood that her role in this lifetime is to tell stories and to be a voice for nature. She's been an environmental consultant, a magazine columnist, an actress, a polar explorer, among other occupations. She's also driven across the country in an 18-wheeler and been a grand prize winner of the Newlywed Game. Soon after Martha and her family relocated from Los Angeles to southern Salem, New York, she began to hear wolves in her backyard. This was the start of her 20-plus year career as an advocate for wolves at the Wolf Conservation Center, where, as I said, she currently serves as the board president. So with that, I want to welcome Martha Hunt Handler.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. This is really exciting. My book touches on a lot of subjects, but I would say the whole grief to... I call it gratitude, is a big one for me. And one of my, I think, most important messages, I hope it's driven home in my book.
Yeah, well, that's great because that ties right in with the theme of what I'm trying to do here is trying to help people to move from those tragic events in their life to learning from them, to going to gratitude or going to growth or whatever that there may be. So you've had some interesting things in your background. What's driving across the country in an 18-wheeler?
I just graduated from college at University of Colorado Boulder, and I was in a Volkswagen, and it was about 110 degrees that day. Mm-hmm. And I shot a piston through my engine, so I knew the car was shot. I had no chance of affording to be able to fix it at that point. And there had been this 18-wheeler who had been following me, and I probably had very short shorts on, and he was kind of honking his horn at me, and he would go ahead of me, and then I would go ahead of him. And as I was sitting on the side of the road with all my stuff, boxes and boxes, wondering what I was going to do, because I think I was at least 60 miles from the next town, he pulled up behind me and said, "Let's put your car on my trailer and I'll take you to the gas station." And I mean, it sounds crazy now, but that was back in the day. I was like 81. I hitchhiked all over the place, didn't think anything of it. And I'm like 5'10". He was probably 5'4". He was a very small guy. So I wasn't particularly worried. Anyway, he was great. It was the most enlightening trip I've ever had. I mean, really? A little scary. The number of drugs that he did to be able to stay up, the number of hours that he needed to stay up. But you always seemed perfectly sane. And I learned just so much about being on the road and what it's like to basically live in a 18-wheeler. And for me, I got to sit on a double bed, and he was buying me magazines and meals, and it was an awesome trip.
Wow. So that was one of your early life experiences.
Yes.
And you've had, it sounds like, several different careers. You were a polar explorer. You've been an actress. So tell me about some of how one thing led to another. Because I always find it fascinating how life kind of comes at us. You know, we can look back on it and make sense of it, but when we're going through it, it can be crazy.
Doesn't seem, very crazy. So when I was very, very young, probably starting when I was 4 or 5, growing up in Northern Illinois, it was woods sort of all around me. We were the first house in what was going to be a planned subdivision. Mm-hmm. And my parents were very open to me going out on my own from a very young age. And so I was always in the woods, and I could hear animals speaking to me very strongly with different voices. And they were all worried about the same thing, about that the whole area was going to be destroyed and they were going to lose their habitat. Mm-hmm. And I was always going to my parents to, tell them that this is really scary and can we stop it? And I don't think they had any idea what I was talking about.
Yeah.
And I was probably like 7 before I mentioned it to a friend who also acted like I was crazy. And so I kind of shut that part of myself down because I didn't want to be crazy.
Yeah.
And I think that's another, a big lesson in my book about being yourself and like listening to anything that comes to you and embracing your uniqueness. Because I think as children and teenagers, we want to fit in. And it's sort of it's a sad thing because I think we leave the knowing and the best part of ourselves behind or try to shut it down, which is not a good thing. So as time went on, I would hear the voices just became much more faint. And then I graduated high school really early when I was 16. And I didn't want to go to school in Illinois, which was all my father was willing to pay for. So I decided to take off in my car. It ended up breaking down in Steamboat, Colorado. And when I was talking to the mechanic about what was wrong, he's told me it was probably going to be at least $600, which I certainly didn't have. So he said, why don't you come pump gas for me? You can live in my garage and you can pay it off that way. Mm-hmm. So I did. And it was an interesting time in Steamboat because it was actually for sale. The ski mountain was. Mm-hmm. And up until that point, they didn't allow any franchises, no fast food. They were really strict about what they were allowing there. Mm-hmm. And a company, I can't remember who it was, but somebody in Texas bought it and got all their people on the board. And all of a sudden things really started to happen quickly and not in a good way. Mm. Tall buildings were going up and it was bad. And I started hearing nature again really strongly. And so when I went to college, I decided, I'll have to be an environmental. I'll have to do something environment. And back in 1980s, there was no major like that. So I sort of made one up. I had started off in environmental engineering and quickly realized that this wasn't going to help me or enable me to do what I wanted to do. So I just kind of made up my own major. And when I graduated, a few years later, I ended up in Washington, D.C. And by that point, there was a lot, it was easy to do environmental consulting. So I worked for a private firm, but we mostly did our work with the EPA and Department of Energy. I worked on a lot of nuclear programs. And it was interesting work, but it wasn't, I transferred there. Then I went to transfer to San Francisco and then Los Angeles. And it was becoming less fulfilling as time went on. In LA, pretty much it was all oil spill cleanups and things like that. So not very rewarding. Yeah. And then I was like pretty open to what was going to happen next. We ended up moving to where we are now in South Salem, New York. And since I was very young, I'd always had wolves in my dreams. And they were not necessarily there with any other animals. It would just be like a wolf would pop into my dream and kind of point out something, like a road I should be taking and that I was not paying attention to. Sort of just like a teacher would show up, but always there was some kind of lesson behind it. So I started hearing these wolves howling, and I think at first I might be crazy, but my husband hears it, my kids hear it, so I'm like, okay, I guess not. I walked into the backyard one day, into this forest, and I found an enclosure with 3 wolves in it, and next to it was a trailer, and I knocked on the door and met Hélène Grimald, and she was, at the time, I think about 26 years old. She's from Aix-en-Provence in France. She was the youngest student to ever graduate from the Paris Conservatory. And she told me that she'd become psychically connected to a wolf, and the wolf had told her that wolves were in huge trouble. And she decided, okay, this is what I'm going to devote my life to. This makes sense to me. Given her touring schedule, she's really famous. She would never be able to have a family or settle down. So she decided she would draw. She always wanted to live in America. She drew a circle around JFK because that was the airport she needed to get to her international dates. And she picked this property and was just starting out. It wasn't yet a nonprofit. She was just starting to raise money and figure out how to do the paperwork. And she asked me to jump on board, and I did. And that has been like a guiding force in my life, because I feel it immediately felt like, okay, I'm in tune with what I'm supposed to be doing here. And it was interesting because recently I was having stomach pains for a couple of years. I'd been to every doctor's. No one could figure out what my pains were. I went to a clinic in Austria for a few weeks. And as part of the program, you see a lot of different doctors in different, sort of like internists and also psychiatrists and a shaman. So when I went to the shaman, he put me into a trance, and then he startled me a couple of weeks, like probably 5 minutes into it, I think. And he shook me awake and he said, "Do you do something with wolves?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Because there's like 50 of them in my office right now."
Interesting. Wow.
I've never had this happen to me before. He said, "Okay, I'm going to put you back under." And when I came back out, he said, "So I'm just going to give you the message from the wolves." And they say, "Stick in your wolf lane. Like, you're becoming so diluted because you're so worried about everything else environmentally that's going on that you're not doing the work that you were put on the planet to do. And your whole stomach will calm down once you're back on track." So I thought that was a really interesting, and I often have to remind myself of this experience. It only happened like a year ago, but it's easy, especially now during COVID, I think, to keep getting distracted by so many other things. Yeah. And then I start feeling the pains in my stomach, and I have to completely recenter, and then they go away.
Well, it's interesting you got that message, right? So now you know the path that you need to be on.
Loud and clear.
Yeah. So let's talk about the book. Okay. So when did you start writing the book, and what made you decide to start writing the book?
So it's been a long journey. I'll back up and just go to my childhood a little bit, in that I grew up very, I would say, spiritually from my mother. She brought me to funerals all the time because she was sort of like the Mother Teresa of our town. And I could always feel if spirits were in the room or not. And we would talk about it. And then I probably started in middle school going to a friend's mother who brought like maybe 6 girls together who were, I think about 13 or so. And we talked about spirituality and we read books together. And the mother was my best friend Gretchen's mother. And during that time, her little sister passed away. And it was very interesting because she was sick for probably 6 weeks. And I was about to go out of town, and I was just saying goodbye to her, and I'd see you, I'll see you when I get back. And she said, "You won't see me again. I'm leaving." And when I came back, she had passed away, and she had had a brain tumor. So our spiritual group turned very much to communicating with her, asking her for signs, which she always gave us. And it was amazing to go through that experience with that family, because as horrible as it was, and it's, it's never an easy thing, the ability to communicate with this girl, Sarah, was pretty incredible. So fast forward, I am living in South Salem, and I get the call that, much worse to be the mother, but from Gretchen, saying that she found her 12-year-old son hanging from a belt in his closet while she was home. And I think I was devastated on a level that I didn't expect, because I felt like, yes, but we know that he's right here with us. He's able to be with us all the time now. But I couldn't say that to her, and she couldn't believe any of that stuff because it was just too hard. And as you know, suicides are even worse because there's a lot of guilt that focuses around that situation. Yes. And I listened to so many people at the funeral and afterwards saying, well, if he was so sick, why didn't you get him some help? And yeah, there's just a lot of blame that goes on. It's just devastating. And he wasn't a boy that was having any difficulties that she knew of. He hadn't been depressed in any way. It was really, really shocking. Yeah. And
I think a lot of people don't realize that, especially with youth suicides, that they don't always show the classic signs of depression that we would expect. They can be very outgoing and seemingly happy. And this has happened to a couple of friends of mine, and actually very recently. And you're, like you said, there's always this guilt that the parent has. Well, why did I miss this? How did I miss this?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, something I want to tell you about today. My podcast platform, Buzzsprout, has recently made it easier for me to allow you to support me financially. Go to www.grieftogrowth.com/subscribe. That's grief2growth.com/subscribe. And once you're there, you can sign up to support me financially. Now, you can do it for as little as $3 a month, or of course, as much as you'd like. If you do that, you'll get access to bonus episodes, and you'll see those in the regular feed. They'll have a lock on them. But when you become a subscriber, you'll actually get access to your own private feed, and you'll be able to listen to the regular podcast along with the bonus podcast for the subscribers. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for sharing the podcast. And I want to thank those of you who support me financially. Have a great day, and on to the episode.
So horrible. So on top of this, Gretchen felt very strongly that he didn't commit suicide, which was, crazy thinking on everybody's part, but she was really sure that he didn't. And I believed her. And she came out to New York from Illinois because she still lives in the town we were born in. And we saw a medium together. And it was actually a really interesting group because it was probably about 2 months after 9/11 happened. Mm-hmm. And it was a group for parents who had lost children. And she couldn't afford the single session. So I think there was 10 groups of 2. So you could bring your spouse or someone else in the family or a best friend. She brought me because her husband was not really into it. Mm-hmm. And that was amazing. And reaffirmed both of our beliefs, I think, about it. Just, I think we refocused for sure about, okay, he's still with us and we have to believe that completely and not give in to the belief that he's not here with you. And she had been asking him to show her a sign, and he appeared one night and she said, I felt like he was almost admonishing me, like, Mom, you of all people know that I'm still here. You don't need me to be, sending you feathers or dragonflies. Come on, you're way better than this. And the group was really interesting. So I think there was 4 people of the 10 that lost son, and they each came through basically saying, remember, it was our time to go. I know it seems crazy that many people go at one time, but in the overall planetary souls leaving and coming, it wasn't an extraordinary day or moment. It was just, we'd planned this for a very long time. It just happened to be that we were all together in that one moment. And before when the medium was saying before everyone got there for the last 4 days, the souls had been kind of lining up and telling him what to purchase that would help their loved ones believe that there was communication going on between them. And it was a lot of religious things, pictures of saints or medals or things like that. And my girlfriend Gretchen was sort of like, well, if he, gives anything to me, we'll know this whole thing is a hoax. And she was the only one that got nothing. And when her son did come through, he said, I never planned this death. It happened really suddenly. But I see now that it was the right thing. What I needed to accomplish in this lifetime I put myself in the wrong circumstances to be able to do what I needed to do. And it was better for me to just abort the situation. And I'm sorry for the pain that it caused.
Wow.
So not long after this, I was just journaling every day, trying to think of ways to comfort Gretchen, who was really not doing very well and was about to get a divorce. And she still had other kids who really needed her. And I was skating on a lake with a friend, and I found this dead deer that had been frozen into the surface. And for some reason, at that moment, it triggered something. And I started hearing from her son, who was encouraging me to write a book about this experience. And I kept saying, but I don't even know what happened. I mean, what am I writing? I don't even know what happened. But I just trusted that if I showed up, things would start getting written. Now, it was a long journey because it took me 18 years from that moment to the book finally being published.
Yeah.
But I think it was a journey I needed to go on. And I think quieting my mind enough to hear his voice also meant that I let in a lot of other voices. And it took me a while to be strong enough to say, this is not your story. I can get to your story maybe at some other point, but this has got to be Brandon's story because that's my focus right now. And so it was a lot of sort of growing and listening to him and believing that what I was hearing and writing had some truth to it. And more things just kept coming up for me, like the important things in my life. Like, I just feel like you need to really try to tap into your knowing and your strength, because I think at a vulnerable age, it only takes one sentence. It only takes a math teacher telling a little girl in 6th grade that numbers aren't your thing for you to just close up that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or an art teacher telling you, boy, you're just not very creative, or you don't have a creative bone in your body. Just don't even think about that as a career. Or for me, it was my dad. I remember it so distinctly because during the writing, my father had passed away and I was cleaning out boxes, and I came upon this book that I had written when I was 7 years old and illustrated. I remember staying up super late that night because they were out to dinner and I wanted to show it to them. And I felt like, I'd found myself. I'm going to be a writer. And when they walked in the door and I showed them, my dad said, well, it's not a very good story and you'll never make money as a writer. So put that right out of your head. And that really shut me down. I mean, I really never gave it another thought again until this happened with my friend's son. I was a magazine columnist, so I could write. It was more like a humor column. I'd always written nonfiction, but getting back to believing in myself, and I wondered if my dad hadn't said that to me, what my path would be. Although, ultimately my path is my path and I'm on it, I'm sure. Right.
Yeah, that's another excellent point that I think you bring up. You talked about how quickly we can shut down and how open children are. And I think it's very important with children to speak words of encouragement to them and to be very careful with the criticisms, because I think children come in just naturally open. And I mean, intuitively. And then we say things like, well, that's silly. That's just your imagination. Or as you said, we say, you're not really good at that, or you'll never make any money doing that. And we don't realize how deeply that goes into a child's psyche.
Yes. And it, like, that old saying, which I really hate now, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Yeah.
When I think it's just the opposite, right? I mean, boy, oh boy. I just finished, I don't know if you've read it, but Glennon Doyle's Untamed.
I have not.
And it's sort of her journey. She was told, I think when she was 9, that one of her teachers said something like, oh, you're going to have to really watch your diet because you're already getting a little chunky around your middle. Mm-hmm. And she became bulimic at 10 years old.
Yeah.
And I think, all those things are increasing so much. So we really, really have to be careful, as there's just so many things that you can implant without ever giving it a second thought. I know I have a friend who's, she was one of the first plus size models. Although I hate that word, but whatever. She would always warn me because, I'm a woman in my 60s and I'm like constantly needing to lose weight, and she was like, you can't even say it around your daughter, not one time, like, or son probably, don't just take the carrot and not the cheese. Don't say anything about why you're making that decision. It's one thing when you're around your girlfriends and they're all in the same boat, but to say anything derogatory about your body or dieting to young girls and young boys is not a good idea.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm really excited to tell you about my latest ebook. It's 4 lessons that you can learn from the near-death experience without going through all the trouble of dying to learn them. I've been studying NDEs for several years now. I am completely convinced that not only are they 100% real, but that there's some very universal wisdom that we can get from the near-death experience. And I've distilled that down in this book into 4 short lessons. And I've also given you all the reasons why I believe that NDEs are absolutely real. So go to www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons to pick it up for free. www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons. I hope you enjoy it. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important that we do watch our words around young people. So you've taken this experience that you've had, this spiritual journey that you've been on, the tragic death of your friend Gretchen's son, and kind of poured it into this fictional story. We're going to call it fictional, but it sounds like there's a lot of elements of truth to this.
A lot of elements. So I would say my protagonist, Bean, who's 15 when the story starts, and it's her 17-year-old brother who's passed away. Sorry.
Wolves.
Yes.
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.grief2growth.com, or text GROWTH, GROWTH, to 31996. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF2GROWTH to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
Hold on. Like the fictionalized, idealized version of myself. If I had believed in myself and believed in my knowing and believed in my voices and listened to myself. So she is convinced that her brother did not commit suicide. She was incredibly close to him. It was her soulmate for life. And she has 2 older brothers that she's not as close to at all. And so she is unable to grieve, because how do you grieve for somebody that you never knew? I mean, just nothing makes sense to her. So her best friend agrees that let's go figure out. If you don't believe it happened, I don't believe it happened. Let's go do what we can do. So they decide to interview everybody that he was with in the last few days before he passed. They don't really find a lot of information there, but she's also learning more about her own family because she interviews her brothers and realizes that she might have sold them short, might have made judgments about who they were as people, and maybe that's not really who they were. Mm-hmm. And then they start doing they do a shamanic ritual, which is a really heavy experience. And it's a lot about girlfriends being good girlfriends, sticking with each other, believing in each other. And then there's a wolf that keeps showing up. And he was, this brother, Sam, was very into Inuits for some reason, who are natives from Canada, the native people. And so they're reading all of his Inuit books, and they believe that you can transition from animals to people, back to animals again at your whim, when you pass, whenever. So the sighting of this wolf, now they're in northern Minnesota, but seeing a wolf in the middle of the day is a very unusual thing. They're pretty elusive creatures. And she's seeing this one black wolf more than one time, and starts believing that it might be her brother that's hanging around her. And so it talks a lot about, I think, the better way that our native cultures dealt with death, a belief that it was simply a transition and nothing more. And I think, like, we know that scientifically that energy cannot be made or destroyed, but we don't think about that in terms of, so what do people think happens to a soul? It can't just disappear, which is always, I thought, really interesting. Anyway, it's a mystery, so I can't tell you and ruin the whole secret.
Yeah, sure.
I would say that it's an interesting ending.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. So how did you decide to include the Inuit element into the story?
Because I watched Nanook in the North when I was in third grade, and I became obsessed with Inuit. If you could see my office right now, it's like full of Inuit things I have. Mm-hmm. Yeah, furs and feathers and like tons of Inuit books. I think I've had many lives as I think it's been past life stuff. Yeah. I just really strongly related to them. And maybe a reason that I like being a polar explorer, like any chance I'll get, I'll go to Antarctica or the Arctic. I feel most at home there. I don't know. It feels like my place. Yeah. Can't get any of my friends to agree to go with me because they're all like, last thing I want to do is go someplace cold. But it's just so peaceful and quiet, and a silence like you don't really get to hear anymore.
Yeah. It's interesting how it seems like we have callings to places and things and stuff. I think possibly from past lives. I interviewed someone, I'm working with her a little bit. Her name is Robin Lansong, and she was actually kidnapped. She grew up, I think, in Philadelphia, and she was kidnapped by this guy and taken to Africa. And I guess for the first time in her life, felt at home there, a little white girl in South Africa among these black people that were their thing. The tradition was singing and stuff. And she felt just so at home there. And even to this day, and Robin's in her 40s or 50s, I'm going to guess, she's just drawn to that culture. So it's interesting. It sounds like you've got a similar experience with the native Canadians.
Yes. So this is interesting. I've always been I had hair down to my waist. I wore it like Pocahontas. I had headbands on. I mean, that was just kind of me because my grandfather was an Algonquin Indian. And even though he didn't talk much and he wasn't like the nicest, friendliest guy, for some reason, I was just obsessed with it. And I recently did 23andMe and found out that nope, no Native American ancestry. At the time, I was going to see a psychic not too much later, and I was like, I'm just devastated, and he's like, that's your blood, but you've been in those lives for many. I could give you a lot of instances, but you have been in Native cultures, lived in those cultures many lifetimes. It doesn't matter what your blood is, but
Yeah, I think we place too much emphasis on our physical DNA and not enough on our spiritual DNA. And we're starting to understand, I think, a little bit better that we have spiritual DNA that comes from our past experiences. It's not necessarily physical.
Yeah, I think it's really important.
So, the book, it sounds like, I know it's kind of positioned as, I think, a young adult book, but it sounds like it'd be great for people of all ages because of the very difficult themes in the book. Not difficult in terms of things that most people don't really like to face, but I think the really deep questions. Yes,
I think so too. I think it'd be a great book for book groups. I think it's a good mother, daughter, father, just there's lots of openings to have discussions around this, all these, so many different topics. It's hard, I think, when you're brought up believing in reincarnation and past lives, and you can be in touch with pretty much to be, and those that aren't. And it's hard for me to have to me. I just had my kids, I have 4 kids in their 20s, and they're all back living with us during this COVID. And they have each had, a friend from growing up that is overdosed during this time. And it's been really sad and hard for them. And in each one of these cases, the child had been recovered for a year or 2. And so it's come out of the blue. And I know this is happening everywhere. It's just a terrible time for people that have any kind of substance issues and psychological issues and whatnot. And I only was friends with one of the mothers, and I had called her to tell her how sorry I was. And I knew that she had similar beliefs to mine. And so she was telling me, yeah, I just had this really interesting experience because, I do believe he's around me, but physically it's really hard for me because he lives so close and we connected every day. And that part's really, really difficult. So I had gone to a bookstore the other day to say, and I just, walking into it said, her son's name was Sean, Sean, could you please send me to a book that's going to help me right now. I just need just a little something. And so she walked into the store, and this drum medley was on that her son played all the time. And it was his ringtone on his phone. And she thought, this is just so weird because it's a very obscure drum. And she was in the section on spirituality, and she asked the bookseller if he could recommend any book. And her son, she heard his voice saying signs. And so she said, does signs mean anything to you? And she goes, yeah, the book is right in front of your eyes. And pulled it out. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but it's called The Secret Language of the Universe by Laura Lynn Jackson. And after that, I said, should we read it together and we'll, maybe discuss it? And she's like, that'd be great. So I'm reading it right now. And it's just so funny when you open that door. I was sitting here reading it, sitting in our lake on an inner tube, and it was talking about how fireflies and dragonflies are they show up a lot when you're trying to reach out. And I had 5 fireflies land on me and just hang out while I was reading the book. And then it said, electronic things can often start going crazy. And I was all of a sudden my cell phone wasn't working. I went up to do something on my computer. It was doing some really weird stuff. And I don't know. I think, when you open yourself up and you're in that place, it just floods you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've heard you in your podcast say synchronicity. I always say there's no coincidences. There's only coincidence. And yeah, as soon as you're just open a little bit, they come flooding in, and it's awesome.
Yeah. Some people call them God winks. I call them Easter eggs. Shane and I like to play video games, and programmers put these little things in the game that are just kind of little nods that that they're there. And so I look at it as kind of like whoever's controlling this, whoever's behind the curtain or whatever, every once in a while they give us these little things. And if you look for them, they become really prevalent, and they become undeniable. Everybody I've seen that's kind of opened up to that could, you could start to see these things, happen in your life.
That's so cool. I didn't know that. Never heard that before. That's great.
Yeah. So this world, and that's what I really like about the story that you're telling, because it does take us beyond the material and maybe a non-threatening way to people. And as I was thinking about this, and as I was reading your materials before we got on, as I said, I work with helping parents heal. So a lot of times when that child has died by suicide, the other kids are left behind. We don't even know how to talk to them. It's hard enough to talk to a sibling anyway, but when it's a suicide, it brings this whole different level of things. And kids approach things differently when they're in their teenage years and stuff. They don't process grief necessarily the same way we do. So I think maybe your book could be a non-threatening way to introduce these concepts to a child that doesn't maybe want to talk about it.
Yeah, I think so. So at least she doesn't have Bean does not have the part that says there was things left unsaid because she was so close to her brother, but her brothers have that. I mean, they all, the three of the boys shared a room together, but the other two brothers were sort of, athletic. They thought he was kind of crazy. He had long hair. He was always trying to live out in nature as much as possible. They just didn't relate to him on a whole lot of levels. But when he passes, there's such a sense of, why didn't I say that I loved him? Why didn't I hug him more? Why didn't I show him that I thought he was a really cool guy for doing things that weren't done by anybody else? So I think, that's such an important lesson too, right? Like just remind yourself to tell the people around you every day, how much you love them and care for them, and how cool it is when someone does something that's unexpected or different, and that it was probably a painful thing for them to come out and say that or do that. It's just,
Well, you touched on this earlier, but I think, do you believe that even when people pass early, and I rarely use the word died because I don't believe anybody dies. We transition. But when people transition early, do you think that's a planned thing?
I do. I mean, from everything that I have listened to and read, it seems like there is almost like a contract being signed that you're going to do this in this amount of time and then move on. I think there are incidences where you get here and it's not, maybe you picked the wrong parents, maybe you picked the wrong geographical location, maybe some other situation is not quite what you had thought. And so maybe you decide to go earlier than you might have. For the most part, most of us go when you had planned to go. And so I try in the book to get people to see, like, none of us were promised tomorrow. So all we have is what we've already experienced. So when someone passes, it's such a great time to think of all that they gave to you in the time that they were here. And it might be 6 months, and it might be 5 years, and it might be 50 years, and it might be 100 years, but that's what you have of that person. Everything that they gave to you, that they shared with you, that you learned from them, because that's all you really have.
Yeah. Those are also very important lessons, because whether it's suicide or whatever, we're not promised tomorrow. When my daughter Shayna transitioned, she was healthy. She just come back from a volleyball tournament. And, we always think we've got tomorrow, we've got a long time when people are young, and we need to seize the moment. We have to embrace the day. And you made another really good point. We need to, whatever amount of time we have with them, let's be grateful for that time and hold on to that. But we can continue the relationship as well. And that's, right. I think, an important lesson, that it doesn't have to be the end. It's just different.
I always say, just start talking to the people that have passed. I always talk to my mom, and maybe it's my voice answering, but maybe it's hers. Why not be open to the thought that it isn't my voice? She's telling me, giving me her advice. And I think it's such a better way to think, right? I mean, it's been so hard in New York City especially in March and April and part of May, when our hospitals were completely full. Our ICUs were overflowing. There was bodies being put on trucks, and people were so fixated on, I didn't get to say goodbye. There was no last rites.
Right.
And like, I listened to all your podcasts and everything else, and you're like, those things are just, constructs. I would think that the one thing you would want religion to do would be to uplift you in those times and give you the feeling that it's okay. There was no physical thing that needed to be done. You didn't need to physically be with them. You didn't need to be holding their hand. You didn't need to be giving them last rites. That's really immaterial. They left and they're still with you. So like, embrace that, because I feel there's so much hurt right now with people not getting that final farewell and being kept out of the hospitals. And I wish there was a way to just try to help them a little bit. It's a horrible feeling if you are part of a religion that makes you feel that without that final word, they're going to, fire and brimstone. Although, everyone that's ever left and came back, I don't think there's ever been an experience that was in any way anything we would connotate with hell, right? I mean, they're all really positive experiences.
There are some negative experiences, what they call negative experiences. They're fairly rare, but what's interesting, I've interviewed PMH Atwater, who studied, thousands of near-death experiences. And she told me a story. She said there were two people in a seminar she was giving. One person stood up and said, I had a heavenly experience when I had my NDE. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me, because they came back and they were maladjusted and they just had a really terrible time. Another person had what we call a hellish experience, and she said it was the best thing that ever happened to her. So there are some people that have those experiences, but they're always temporary. And they're usually, I think they're the projections of our own imagination, and no one ever stays in them. So, but the idea that there's eternal hell is just, that's nowhere from anybody that's ever had a near-death experience. It says that exists. But yeah, you made another point earlier. This is a choice as to how we look at things. And it's such a much better way to look at things. It's so freeing. And this idea, and I've seen these people too, that they're just heartbroken that my loved one died alone. I wasn't there to say goodbye to them. Well, first of all, I've been told by many mediums, no one ever dies alone, that there's always somebody there to meet us. So we don't die alone. They didn't die, that way. And when you think, I wish I'd been there, they probably came to you right away. Probably as soon as they were out of their body, they were right there with you. So we've got to get over this hang up with the physical body. Yeah. That I wasn't there with their body when they died, and just look at it as they just slipped out of their body and then they were free to be wherever they wanted to be.
Yes. Yeah. I listened to a few of yours and others where, that sense of like looking back down at your body all hooked up and doctors going crazy and you're like, it's such peace. Mm-hmm. And do I want to go back into that? So when my mother passed, she had lung cancer, and I went home to help my dad take care of her. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I got there, my dad checked out, and I don't know where he went every day so early and stayed all day and came home very late, but I basically wasn't seeing him. And I had just had my third child, and he was a baby, and I had to stop breastfeeding to fly home to be with so I was like in agony. Mm-hmm. And my mother and I talked about it all the time. And, she was feeling really guilty that I was there. And she was like, starve me, because that's probably the quickest way. Like, just give me like a little sip and then stop it. And we kept saying, is there somebody you haven't seen? Because hospice kept saying, oh, she won't last 48 hours. And it was like another week and another week. Yeah. And it was going on for like 2 months. And she was like, well, invite this person. And nothing was, we couldn't figure out what was keeping her here.
Yeah.
And then one day a girlfriend called, and she had just had a baby, and it was before cell phones. And I was like, I called this diner to see if my dad happened to be there. It's the only place I could think he would be that early in the morning. And he was there. And I said, you need to get home, because I need to go to the hospital to see a girlfriend. So we came home, and I didn't even get to the hospital before my dad called me and said, your mom just passed. And it was like, of course she needed to be with my dad. Not that she needed to be with my dad, but I think my dad would have been devastated given how little time he spent with her in those last few months if he hadn't have been there. So that was pretty amazing.
It is. And I have a friend, Deborah Diamond, she's a death doula. And she says that basically, until the body is ready, then we don't go. And until our soul is ready, we don't go. And people go at whatever the right time is. And it's interesting because people, when they're in hospice, a lot of times, sometimes they'll wait till someone comes and sometimes they'll wait till someone leaves. I guess a lot of times they'll pass when the family's out of the room and people say, oh, I missed their passing. It's like, no, they wanted you to be out of the room when they went. That was intentional. So we have to feel like we have to understand however it happened, that's how it's supposed to happen.
Yes. When my father went into a diabetic coma, and when he came out of the hospital, he was put in a rehab facility, and he was sort of, I don't know, like that dementia where maybe he had one foot in the other world and one foot here, and it was very confusing for him. But one of my brothers had promised him he'd never put him in a nursing home, and that was going to be the next step. And the nurses were telling me, it doesn't make sense for your brother to take him home. Your dad's a very large man. It's going to be very hard to keep him comfortable and keep enough people around him for him to be safe and in a good spot. And you've got to convince your brother. But it was just, he was like, I only made one promise to dad and I'm not going to break it. So I contacted one of those death doulas and was just asking her, and she said, okay, I'm tapping into him. I think he was like an engineer, right? And I said, yeah. He said he was very calculated about everything, and he was supposed to be letting go and going in a different direction. He didn't really do that, but he's doing the work right now. And I can't tell you if it's going to take an hour or if it's going to take years.
Oh, wow.
But he's doing the important work right now. And he's not in a place that he can understand where he is. So it will not in any way harm him to putting in a nursing home. But of course, my brother still was like, oh, and I don't care about your crazy thoughts. Like, I'm taking him home. Yeah. So the morning that he was being packed up to leave, he, right as the van pulled up, he passed away.
Oh, wow.
So it was like, thank you. But it was an interesting experience when you have a sibling and you're on very different pages with this whole thing. And I understand, but I would say to people, never make anyone promise they won't put you in a nursing home. I always tell my kids, just do what's ever most comfortable for you. And I am totally okay with that.
Yeah, that's the lesson we've had to learn. My father-in-law went through dementia, and he was a really outdoorsman, loner, Daniel Boone, type of guy or whatever. But he ended up with the dementia to the point where he was just in and out. And I think, it's interesting now, this happened 7-8 years ago, I guess now, maybe even longer. And I look at it differently now that I've learned so much, because I think he was crossing over and coming back. And he would say things that made no sense from this existence. And Raymond Moody talks about the nonsense that people start to talk about when they're passing, which is really sensical, but not from our physical perspective. So that whole thing with dementia is really, an interesting thing. And it's interesting that mediums can actually tap into those people a lot of times.
Yes.
And talk to them, and they're whole. They're whole, but they're just not connected with the body anymore.
Yeah, I walked into his room one day when he was still in the hospital, and he said, oh, you just missed your mother. And my mother had passed like 10 years before that. So I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. And I said, she's definitely gone. He goes, yeah, I don't see her anymore. And then he said, but your brother and his friends were here like all night. So I'm really tired. And I knew my brother hadn't been there. So I was like asking my brother, and he had become a born again Christian. And I guess he was with his group the night before, and they had been praying for my father.
Oh, wow.
So it was very cool.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. And that's the perspective that we can have when we open up our minds to it. Because I was going to say maybe your brother was there in the astral or something, but once we get untethered from our body, your father was untethered. So he was able to visit these different realms. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Martha, it's been really great getting to know you and to hear about Winter of the Wolf. It sounds like an awesome book, I think for adults and for young adults. Where can people find out more about you, and where can they get the book?
So my website is marthahunthandler.com. grieftogrowth.com.
Mm-hmm.
I recently, I added hunt because someone told me in Estonia, the word hunt means wolf. So I was like, okay, so I'm basically a wolf handler, which is what I do.
Wow.
Yeah. So very cool.
So, and your book, I assume, is available anywhere.
Anywhere.
And it's Winter of the Wolf, and it's available now. Today's Friday, July 10th, 2020, just came out. Martha, again, it's really been great getting to know you and to find out more about your story and just hopefully encourage people that are listening to have a different understanding, a broader understanding of what life is really all about.
Yes. Thank you. It was so great, Brian. Really loved meeting you too.
Yeah. You have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Let me stop. Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I want to make it really easy for you to reach me. So just send me a text to 31996 and simply text the word growth, GROWTH. In fact, you can right now just say, "Hey Siri," send a message to 31996. And when Siri asks you what you want to send, just say growth. You can do the same thing with OK Google. Thanks a lot. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for listening to Grief to Growth. Brian hopes that you find this episode helpful and will come back for future episodes. Brian's best-selling book, Grief to Growth, Planted Not Buried, is a great resource for anyone who is coping with grief or knows someone who is. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support it, there are 3 things you can do to help. The first is to share the podcast with someone that you think it will help. The second is to go to iTunes, rate, and review the episode. The third way you can support the podcast is by becoming a patron. Head over to www.patreon.com/grief2growth. That's patreon.com/grief, the number 2, growth, and sign up to make a small monthly donation. Patrons get access to exclusive bonus content and knowledge that you are helping to spread the message of grief to growth. For more about Brian and Grief to Growth, visit www.grief2growth.com.
Hi there. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of the podcast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. What questions came up for you? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? I invite you to visit us at grieftogrowth.circle.so. That's growth2growth.circle.so to continue the conversation with me and with other listeners. It's a space to sound off, to share reactions, and to go deeper into the topics from the show. I look forward to chatting more, and I hope to see you there.